The other thing the Lord began to show me is that anytime you take His grace and you use it one-dimensionally, you'll miss His purposes. So with tongues, when I talk to people who don't speak in tongues, they always just think of tongues as what happened on the day of Pentecost, that it's other languages. I remember hearing a man, he and I were debating this whole thing, and he said, well, I would be open to speak in tongues. And I was surprised that he said that. And I said, well, why? He says, well, if I ever became a missionary, I would just not even study to learn a language. I would just speak in tongues. I remember thinking, it really doesn't work that way. But all he thought of is tongues as other languages. And that's clearly what it says in Acts chapter 2, verse 4. And there's 16 different nationalities or nations on the ground listening in their own language. And so that's what it looks like. But if you follow every instance where tongues happen, that was the only time that happened. Cornelius' house, they all spoke in tongues, men, women, and children, but it didn't get turned into other languages. The Ephesians, they spoke in tongues and prophesied in Acts 19, but it didn't get translated into different languages. So we get in trouble when we take something and we say, it's only this way. Probably the most common one-dimensional thinking use that we have concerning tongues is that if tongues is spoken, there must be interpretation. You cannot ever have speaking in tongues without interpretation. And you get that from reading 1 Corinthians 14. It really does say that, because there are different kinds of tongues. And that was a thing the Lord began to show me. Like, for example, in 1 Corinthians 12:10, it says, to another working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another discerning of spirits, to another divers kinds of tongues. It says in the King James, divers kinds of tongues, or different kinds of tongues. He's not speaking about different languages. There's no reason to say, well, there's different languages. Everyone knows that there's different languages. But there's different ways that tongues is manifested. He says the same thing in 1 Corinthians 12:28, that God has appointed these in the church: first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, after that miracles, and then the gift of healings and helps, administrations, and diversities of tongues. And that little phrase caught me, and I realized, speaking in tongues in public, in a public meeting, and someone else interprets that, that's one kind of tongue. Speaking on a rooftop or in an upper room in Jerusalem, and other people who aren't even believers, their understanding is opened and they understand that you speaking in their language, that's another kind of tongue. And then Paul seemed to talk a lot about a personal praying in tongues, where he said, if someone gets a message, a tongue, and there's no one there to interpret, just say it, keep it to yourself and say it to God. That shows that there's a private use and a public use. So that's two different kinds of tongues, two different kinds of benefits or usages. And there are benefits for both of them. There are benefits in a public speaking of tongues and someone else translate it. You don't hear it very much anymore. I'm not sure why. Some of you maybe have never been in a meeting where someone really was used by the Holy Spirit to speak in tongues and someone else interpreted it. But I remember as a new Christian it happened fairly often, and it was electric. It would change the course of the meeting. You could just tell God was there, God was doing something. It was a major sign. Very, very powerful. Somehow we're losing that these days. I'm not hearing that as much. Speaking in tongues where it gets changed into another language, that's also has powerful benefits as well. I remember the first time I read about a guy named Harold Bradenson. He was learning about tongues and exploring this whole thing about speaking in tongues. And he was in Washington, D.C. And he wanted to find out how this whole thing works. He walks up to a lady who had kind of a dark complexion, dark skin, someone who looked kind of foreign. And he said, listen to this. And he began speaking to her in his tongues that he had been given. She was shocked, and he would be, I suppose, this complete stranger coming up to you speaking in tongues. And she stopped him. She said, "How do you know this? How do you know what you're saying?" He said, "I don't know what I'm saying." And that really shocked her, that he didn't know what he was saying. She said, "I'm Egyptian." And she said, "You're speaking Egyptian, but it's not everyday Egyptian. It's classical Egyptian. It's ancient Egyptian." And she was a student of ancient Egyptian. And it really blew her away. So it became the sign to her. And I hear stories of that where I remember reading one story of a gal who was working in India, and she'd been in an accident of some kind and broke her leg, and she was very discouraged because she couldn't go about her business doing her mission work. She was laid up, and so she was up on her veranda playing her guitar and singing to the Lord, and she was distressed, and so she began singing in tongues. And this guy that I knew, he went with her, and he began singing in tongues with her, and he said her guitar playing changed, her sound changed. They're both speaking in tongues, singing in tongues at the same time. He said all of a sudden it just changed into something they had never heard before, and they're just pouring out their heart before the Lord. While people on the street below understood them singing, and they said, "How do you know our songs?" They weren't just singing the songs, they were playing the melodies, the chords of that tribe, of that people group. And it really blew them away that these white people could know their songs. Well, they didn't know their songs, they were just singing in the Spirit. But people came up from the ground floor, come up and were prayed for, became Christians. They laid hands on them. Some of them were healed. Her mission work took off and went to an entirely different degree of effectiveness. She became so effective, I think they invited her to leave the country. But there's a benefit. There's benefits in every kinds of tongues. But there are different kinds of tongues. For example, I've never spoken in a language where someone else said, "I know what you're saying. You're speaking Hebrew or you're speaking Chinese." I've wanted to try it. I've been in elevators or been around people where I just wanted to see what would happen if I did speak out in tongues, and I've just never had the courage to do that. I've never given a message in tongues and someone else has translated it because I don't have that gift. I think that is properly called the gift of tongues and the gift of interpretation. Those two things do work together. I don't have that grace. What I have is what's called unknown tongues. And it's found in the King James Bible. That's where I first saw this. I noticed that the translators of the King James would insert words that they chose and put it in italics so that everyone would know that they've added the word. And in several verses, the translators added the word unknown in front of tongues because it wasn't a known language. It wasn't other tongues. So Acts 2:4 says they spoke in other tongues as God gave them the utterance, and that became other languages. Clearly that's other languages, but it's a one-time experience. Other verses, like 1 Corinthians 14:2 says, "For he who speaks in an unknown tongue does not speak to men, but to God. For no one understands him. However, in the Spirit he speaks mysteries." The writers, the translators, said this is a different kind of tongue. They were back to diversities of tongues again. They said this is an unknown tongue. This isn't for men. It's not a message in public. It's not a message to a group and someone else translates it. It's not other tongues where even unbelievers have their understanding open and they can understand that. This is different. And they said, we're going to call this, and they chose the word. It's not in the original language, but they chose to call it unknown tongues. And it shows up several times, half a dozen times at least, in the letter to the Corinthians. But listen to this, and this is also a benefit. For he who speaks in an unknown tongue does not speak to men, but to God. For no one understands him. Howbeit, in the spirit realm, like we're in a physical realm here, we see this furniture, we see the walls, we see these windows, tables. This is a realm called the physical realm. Well, in this realm is another realm that you can't see, spirit realm. And that's where angels walk back and forth, demons are busy going back and forth. God comes and goes, and in that realm, there's no time, there's no distance. For me to pray for someone from Penn, New York, for me to pray for someone who's in Australia or Chile or India, I could pray for them from here. There's no distance in the spirit realm. I could pray now and it could have an immediate effect on these other places, other people who are close to me. So in the spirit realm, I can pray in tongues and it can affect the spirit realm. That's powerful. There might be a mystery to me, but it's not a mystery to God. God understands it, and listen now, God gets busy. He starts acting on what's being prayed by the Spirit. For example, 1 Corinthians 14:14 says, "For if I pray in an unknown tongue, my spirit prays, but my understanding is unfruitful." So it's a spirit to spirit. My spirit is praying by the Spirit to His Spirit. That's a powerful benefit. That's a direct connection to the heart of God, direct connection in the Spirit. But it's a prayer language. And he talks about praying in the Spirit. Well, that's another benefit. That's another kind of tongue which has its own benefit. If you pray in an unknown tongue, it says you edify yourself. You edify yourself. And that's an architectural term. We get the word edifice from that. But to build up in a significant way, you can actually pray in tongues and it can benefit your spiritual life architecturally. Someone else explained it this way. They said it's kind of the way they saw when they prayed in tongues, it was like their battery got charged. And it was a way of building themselves up, like their battery gets depleted and then they would build themselves back up. I like that as well. But it's an architectural term, and it's all about building up. We're to build up the body, we're to build up each other, but we're also to build up ourselves. And there's times when we need to do that. And one of the fast ways of doing that is through speaking in tongues, praying in tongues. But there are unknown tongues, there are other tongues, and then there are tongues that are translated or interpreted for the benefit of other people. But there's different kinds of tongues. Amen?